Welcome to the Bigger Cash Flow podcast, where we interview business owners and real estate investors that share tips and tricks on how to grow your cash flow and reach financial freedom.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Bigger Cash Flow podcast. Today, I'm very excited to share with you a special guest. Paul Thompson is a full-time real estate investor based out of Little Rock. He left the corporate world in November 2017, and since then, he has been adding to his rental portfolio through creative financing strategies, such as seller financing and using private money. He also wholesales houses in the Little Rock area. He's turning his personal story of securing 20 deals in his first 18 months of investing to inspire new investors. With that said, let's welcome Paul to the show.
Hey, Bo, thanks for having me.
Now, I'm really excited for the listeners to learn more about your story of real estate investing and especially how you transitioned out of the corporate world to doing this full time. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Sure thing. So I was a traditional corporate employee. I followed the traditional default plan that most of us probably follow. If you're listening to this, you probably followed the advice that your parents gave you, which was to go to college and get a job. And it isn't an all horrible bad life, but it often leaves a little bit something lacking. You start working in this job and you start raising yourself up the corporate ladder. And I started doing that, and I realized that my ladder was on the wrong wall, and it wasn't a rewarding life. And it took me a while to figure that out. I went and got an MBA. I tried to learn and study and figure out what I was searching for. And it turns out I was just kind of spinning my wheels, and I wanted a way to control my life so that I could lead a life based on my plan and my design. And what really finally hit me was that I realized that I was creating somebody else's dream, not my own. And when that light bulb went off, I realized that I had to figure out another way to earn income outside of exchanging my time for money for another corporation. So I looked long and hard for alternative sources of income, passive income investments. I considered buying a franchise or starting an insurance agency. I even looked at like buying ice machines, whatever I could do is to run a business locally here in Little Rock, because I knew at some time, sooner or later, my job, something would happen to it. And I'm a single source income family. My wife stays at home with the kids, and I was vulnerable. I knew I was vulnerable. And so it dawned on me, you know what? I can start buying a rental property and gradually transition, because I was very afraid of this idea of jumping off the edge of the cliff and having to build my parachute or my plane on the way down. I didn't want to have, crash in a fiery ball of disaster, because I didn't know what I was doing. I wanted a transition plan, and I couldn't find anything else that was better than real estate.
Take us through the journey of when you first decided that real estate is going to be, your vehicle, and how you got to do your first deal.
Fantastic. Yes, because I love that, because when I said, you know what, let me start doing some research on rental properties and investing, and Bigger Pockets invariably comes up for most people. So I really went down that rabbit hole, and it was such a wealth of information. And I learned about the BRRRR method, and I learned about private money and networking, and I went out and found a local mentor. What I did is I went to the RIAs first. I went there, and I didn't really find anybody at the RIAs that was somebody that I really felt like I really connected with at that time, because our RIA at the time was fairly small and not all that well organized. It's come a long way since, but I went out and found another investor who'd been doing it for like 30 years. And I just sent him an email and said, you live an hour away. I don't want to compete with you, but I see what you do on your website. I think it has a lot of merit. I'm interested in exchanging my time to help you in your business however I can, in exchange for me learning from you. What can I do to help you? And he did this craziest thing is he called me up and he said, okay, I want you to buy a book, The Richest Man in Babylon, and I want you to write a 3-page handwritten essay and mail it back to me. Oh, okay, that's a little bit a little bit different. It's like this wax on, wax off kind of stuff. And so I did it, and over the next year, I probably wrote 5, 7, maybe 8 essays for him, all handwritten, and I would mail it to him. And it wasn't until many months later that I actually met him in person, and he's only about an hour away from me. So after I started learning some stuff, I felt like I had the wherewithal to go buy some property. So I bought a property from a local wholesaler here in Little Rock, and it was my first deal. And I bought it for $30,000. I borrowed the money from a private lender I met through Bigger Pockets, and put about $10,000 of my own money into it to fix it up. And then I refied it and did the Burr method, paid back my private lender, and I still have that property. It rents for about $650. It's worth $55,000 to $60,000 based on the appraisal, and so I pulled about $40,000 out of that with the refi, and that was my first example. And based on that, I'll say I feel like the theory works. This is something I can do, and this is something I can start to scale. And so I just started adding to the portfolio, and it turns out it wasn't my plan, but it turns out I started doing on average about 1 deal a month.
Wow. Okay, so that was a lot there. So let's kind of unpack a little bit of that. So you mentioned in your first deal, a wholesaler, the Burr method, private money. Our listeners are probably going, wait, aren't you supposed to buy a deal that's rent ready, like turnkey or off the MLS for your first deal? What is a wholesaler? And for our listeners that may not know, and what is the Burr method, and how did you kind of put that all together?
Yeah, first off, a wholesaler is just somebody who typically goes about getting properties under contract and then assigns their interest in their purchase and sell contract to another third-party investor for a fee. That's referred to as wholesaling. They're buying a property at a wholesale price and then selling it for a bit of a markup to somebody else who's willing to actually take title of the property, do the rehab, and that sort of thing. And there are certainly people that do nothing but that. And I do a little bit of wholesaling, but I would not consider myself an air quote wholesaler. We can talk about that more later. The Burr method is a strategy that's been around for a long time, but Bigger Pockets coined the term Burr, I don't know, 5 years ago. And it's buy, rent, or buy, rehab, rent, refi, repeat. So it's a lot in one, but I refer to it as the buy and refi method. You buy it at a discount, you fix it up, and then you refinance it, pull most, if not all of your money back out, and repeat the cycle. And so with only $50,000 or $100,000 of either money that you've borrowed or money that you have in cash or from your HELOC or something like that, you can acquire a property, and then anywhere from 2 to 6 to 12 months later, you can refinance that property after you've seasoned the property, fixed it up, put a renter in there. Then you can pull the money back out with a refinance, and then get access to that $50,000 or $100,000 again, and then redo it, because now you got this long-term institutional debt on your property, which is a fairly competitive interest rate. It's probably the lowest interest rate you're going to get anywhere else. And that property cash flows. It may only cash flow $100 a door, but you have a property that is cash flowing, and then you can go and deploy that money again, and you leave a trail of cash flowing properties behind you.
Yep. And I think this is a prime example of, recycling your capital using the velocity of money,
Yep.
as well as kind of letting your dollars stretch a little bit further, the high risk, high reward system. The trap I see a lot of investor might fall into is working with an inexperienced wholesaler who might tell them, hey, the rehab budget is $10,000 and the ARV is like $100,000, but it's off by 20K or whatnot. And also not being able to put together a scope effectively or overvaluing the potential ARV. How did you kind of overcome that potential risk? And what were some due diligence items that you did for your first deal?
So really good question, because that sounds really good, that strategy I just talked about, but there are pitfalls. And so taking the assumptions of the wholesaler and at face value is dangerous. So a wholesaler is there to sell their property. I mean, that's just, or their access to this contract really is what they're trying to do. And they're doing it for a fee. So they tend to look at houses with rose-colored glasses. They make round estimates on the repairs, and they tend to overinflate the ARV because it's to their benefit to do so. So you basically, anything that a wholesaler tells you, I just take with a grain of salt. Just understand what it is that they're doing. I mean, I have done it before, absolutely, and I still do it when it makes sense for me and my business. But you have to make the deal work for you. And the due diligence assets that or steps that I do to get there is I get several reports on a property. And one of those that I get that most people, I don't hear people talking about enough, is getting a broker's price opinion. It's referred to as a inside BPO. You want to hire an agent, and it's usually in the order of about $100, give or take 20%. And you will send an agent in there to do an inside broker's price opinion, an inside BPO, and they will do an analysis of the property, take pictures, and document what they think the property is currently worth right now in as is condition, and what it would be worth if it after it was fixed up. So they give you the ARV, they give you what they think the repair cost would be. Take that with a grain of salt. They're agents, not contractors. And then they give you the as is value. That as is value is extremely valuable. I don't know of any other place that you can go and get a third party as is value analysis that actually cared what the opinion is. Because when you get a comparative market analysis, a CMA from an agent, they're typically retail agents and they're not actually going inside of the property. And they oftentimes just aren't equipped to know how to look at a property that's not fixed up. It just doesn't, it's not the game they're in. But an agent who is trained to do a BPO, what they're used to doing is doing it for REOs, real estate owned properties. Banks, when banks take properties, they're usually in bad shape, and they send an agent out there to go give them a BPO to get the as is value. Well, you can do the same thing. You can hire an agent to do a BPO, and that report is extremely helpful. I have at least one case where I thought a property was worth way more than it really was, and I hired somebody to do a BPO for $85, and I was able to get a $30,000 discount off the sales price because of that one report. If I had not done that and gone ahead with the property, I would have broken even at best on that deal.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask what the difference between that and a CMA is, because I do get a CMA from my broker. So he's like a retail broker, but he also does like turnkey property management, wholesaling. He does everything. I've never heard of a BPO, but that's interesting. So they actually go to the house, kind of take pictures, not an official appraisal by any means, but it still has definitely some weight in it. And you can use that to further negotiate. So
yes, it is what you might consider an appraisal light. It is very similar to an appraisal. It just isn't quite as in depth, and it is not an official appraisal, and the person doing it is not an appraiser. So there's a little bit extra training associated with being an appraiser. But I also go ahead and many times get an appraisal because I want that property to appraise for something within my realm of operating procedures, or the Burr method doesn't work. So if you are really willing, sometimes you might spend $1,000 on all those reports: a property inspection, a BPO, getting a CMA, which is usually free. You might do some other, like, a termite inspection, depending on where you are. If you're in Florida, you have to do these seawall checks, and there's all these things unique to your area, and then potentially also getting an appraisal. I don't always do that. I know my area very well. I can tell that. But if you're investing from a distance, consider getting an appraisal. And it's not cheap. It's $600. But $600 plus another $400 worth of other reports, $1,000 investment can save you potentially thousands of dollars in mistakes if you didn't get those reports.
In the beginning, you might want to do that, but later on, if you're investing in that same area and you got 4, 5, 6, now you know the area well enough to kind of estimate if it's a similar bed, bath, and square footage. You mentioned earlier, you're taking that report and you're going back to the seller, and you might negotiate a lower purchase price or some credit, or maybe they might pay for some closing costs, or and let's just say you paid $600 for an appraisal or 150 for a BPO. If you save, anything above that, that's above and beyond what you would have gotten. So
That's right.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Well, and it's also peace of mind that a third party has confirmed the assumptions that you've been told about or made yourself. It's really important, especially when you're investing from a distance, having local resources that you trust, and then not just having one person that is your eyes and ears, but having a couple different sources of information. Because an inspector looks at a property one way, an agent looks at it one way, an investor looks at it another. So you want to get a view from several different angles to get a full picture of the investment that you're about to make. And
Yep.
it's incredibly important to work in one area and learn a particular market. And I am not a big fan of chasing down the latest hot market, because there's always going to be the next hot market. And would you rather have 20 properties in one market, or would you rather have one property in 20 markets?
Sounds like a nightmare.
It does, doesn't it? Because you gotta have to find those resources in every market. So it's very helpful. It's okay to be in a few markets if you really want to scale. Sometimes you just run out of access to deals in a certain market. And so you find another person that you know in, say, Indianapolis. Okay, let's go in Indianapolis and let's really hone in there. But I would not skip out of Indianapolis 6 months later and then go to Lexington, or, just fill in the blank. Pick a market and own it. Go deep before going wide.
Yep. No, I think there's definitely something to say about the scalability and the power of being able to kind of really form a team and expand in one market. So no, I think that's awesome. So for this deal, you bought it for 30, you put 10 of your own money for the rehab, and you said it appraised for 50, 60.
Right.
And then, so you got all your money back out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a sweet deal. You pay your private lender back and you keep the cash flow and the equity. Now, you got a taste of that. Tell me how you went from that all the way to 20 in less than 18 months. That's awesome.
Yeah. So what I did next is I bought, I think in the first 2 months that I was doing this, I bought 10 properties, and 9 of them came from a wholesaler, and 1 of them I found on my own. And then I stopped for a little bit. I thought, that's enough. Let me make sure I know how to manage these. Let me figure out how to actually scale this, do my taxes, make sure I'm doing things right. And then a couple months later, I kind of went back to it, and I learned that I wanted to have the ability to find my own deals. I'd had a wholesaler and an agent find my first 10. Now I wanted to find deals on my own. So I started the air quote traditional we buy houses stuff, bandit signs and mailers and dialers and all these tools that you start doing. And I did that, and I kind of built a little small business around going out there and hunting for deals and tracking that down. And that does take work, but I was able to do it while working a full-time job that was a pretty demanding job. And I have my wife's at home, and I have at the time, 2 fairly young kids. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, that's not practical, I can do that. You can. And I coach people who live not in the city, in they live in California, and they're making deals in San Antonio. It's very plausible. And you can get a deal within the first 3 months. That's kind of like my deal, is that you can absolutely, if you take the right steps, you can get access to a deal within 3 months.
With the 9 properties that you bought, was it like a package deal that needed some rehab or some work, or were they stabilized with some tenants already in place? And how did you finance those?
Good question. So 1 of them was a package of 6 that I bought and did a partial owner financing on that. And then I used private money and then did the BRRRR strategy and was able to refinance it out. And so on that closing of those 6 properties, I actually got a check for $20,000 when I bought it. It's because I borrowed a little bit extra because I wanted to have some cash reserves, and I bought it at a pretty good price, very competitive. And it was a 2% plus deal. So meaning that I had, I can't remember the exact numbers now, but let's say the rents were total of $2,500 for all 6 houses, then it was, I bought it for $125,000. So it was right at a 2% deal, if memory serves. And then on the other ones, what did I do? I did one, I bought subject to the existing mortgage, and we can dig into that if you want to. And then I bought another one, 100% financing, and I put a little bit of money in that one myself. I put a down payment about 10%.
Okay. Let's actually talk about that subject too. So in this show, we kind of covered owner financing before, but we've never covered subject to. And one of the things that I love about podcasting is that I get to ask questions that I'm interested in, and
Sure.
I'm starting to learn. So yeah, tell us about that deal, what it is, what are some pros and cons? Maybe there's some pitfalls, and what are some myths as well? Because whenever I learn about creative financing, a lot of investors are like, "Bo, you can't do that. That's illegal," or "This is not right," or that. But a lot of these kind of half truths are out there. So kind of dispel that for us.
Okay. So subject to the existing mortgage. So let's start very simple. Well, anytime you say, I will do something subject to this other exception, all you're saying is that I will do that except whatever I say afterwards. So I will come on your podcast, Bo, subject to you approving my microphone. You have to do something in order to get to the quality that you want, right? Well, it's the same thing when you're buying properties. You say, oh, I'll buy your property subject to the inspection that I have to get in order for that to qualify my standards. Well, you can also do subject to the underlying mortgage that's in place. Basically, I will buy it, but we will keep your mortgage in place. And the next question people ask once they hear that is, well, why would anybody sell their property and leave their mortgage in place? Well, most people won't. That's the short answer. Most people won't, but some people will because they're in a financial pinch. Their circumstances are where they have to move quickly. I knew of a guy that was being stationed. He was moving to Bahrain, and he had to move there, and he had to be there with his family in 60 days. He did not have time to fix his house up, put it on the market, and sell it, and move his entire house to the other side of the world for 2 years. So what we did is we bought his property subject to his existing mortgage, and I agreed that I would start making his payments. And whatever the balance of his mortgage is what the purchase price that I went into. I didn't pay him any money. I just covered his closing costs, and he basically had a problem off his back, and I was there taking care of the property. So you can do that depending on the circumstances of the seller. So you're buying it subject to you making the payments on the underlying mortgage that the seller, the borrower, when they first bought it, has with the property. And it's a way of getting access to a property without a lot of money. And so it is often touted as this great no money down type strategy. And while it is technically true, yes, you can do that. I'm really careful to not over tout the benefits of buying subject to the existing mortgage because there are risks to it. And one of those is, for one, you're promising to make somebody else's payment. They are putting a lot of faith in you. If you do not make those payments, then you are hurting somebody else's credit and you are hurting somebody else's trust in you, which is the most important thing we have is a reputation. And so if you don't have a good financial position and you have $1,000 to your name and you agree to buy a house that the next month's payment is $1,000 and you can't find a renter in time, what are you going to do? Or what if there's a repair that you didn't anticipate? There's a roof replacement all of a sudden that, in your deductible is $3,000 on your insurance. What are you going to do? So you got to think about that going into it, that properties cost money. And just because you got clever financing on the front end doesn't mean you're not going to solve for something later on. So it helps to have cash, access to cash to solve problems. So with that disclaimer out of the way, it is a really cool way to control the property. And what you're effectively doing is buying the other person's financing. As an investor, you may not have credit, or you may be self-employed, or you may have so many loans out right now that you don't qualify for these traditional 30-year Fannie Mae type traditional loans. Well, why don't you just go use somebody else's? Because they're in a pinch and you have the wherewithal to know to ask to do so and buy a property subject to their mortgage.
My two key takeaways that I'm hearing from you is, number one, you're not looking for sellers that kind of want to sell, right? You're looking for sellers who are in distress. They need to sell. So these sellers aren't just going to be on the MLS or just like on Facebook, hey, come contact me. You might have to do some work, surprise, and go find these guys. But, your prize at the end of the day is the equity and, the financing that's already in place.
Exactly.
And the second key takeaway that I got from listening to you is the deal still has to make sense. I mean, like you mentioned, it can be creative on the front end. And I see a lot of investors like, I'm going to go get a, lease option or a subject to or seller financing, but I'm going to be in the negative cash flow 100 a month, but it's still creative. It's awesome. No, it's not. It's going to cause you problems down the road. You want to make sure it cash flows and in line with what your goals are. So that's why I, tell people, you have to kind of set your baseline expectation, because if you don't, any lead that comes your way, you're going to think it's a good deal, but it might not fit your goals. So that's kind of my 2 cents when I hear about creative financing.
I agree. Don't buy an alligator unless
Yeah.
you know exactly what you're doing. There are circumstances when you're much more seasoned and you have tons of cash flow that you might buy an alligator, meaning that it's a negative cash flow position because you're looking for the potential upside, the equity buy-in later on. But the thing about equity is you can't eat it until you sell it.
Yep.
So especially if you're just getting started, you want to be buying for cash flow to begin with. You can graduate into the next level of investing for appreciation and equity later down the line. One other thing about sub two that I'd like to add that I didn't get a chance to say before, I said a lot, so I wanted you to process that. There is something called the due on sale clause that you need to be aware of. And this is a potential pitfall with subject to investing. So any mortgage that, especially if it's written up by a bank, has a clause built into it that if you buy it, if the title transfers and you don't satisfy the loan, then the bank has the right to accelerate and call the loan due immediately. It's often referred to as the due on sale clause, and it is a right for the bank to call it due, not an obligation. Or if they care and notice, then they can call it due on you. So you have to keep that risk in mind that if for some reason you buy a property subject to the existing mortgage and the lender notices it, doesn't like it, and wants to call the loan due, they can, and then you are supposed to pay off that entire property there. So that's why you want to buy a property with equity into it, so you can fire sell it, solve that problem if that were to happen. Now, it isn't really common for a bank to call a loan due like that, because most banks are actually loan servicers and they aren't actually banks. The Bank of America and all these things that we talk about, the people you're talking to typically, they're the loan servicing departments, and they just want to make sure the loan's being paid. They don't actually care. There are exceptions. There is a bank, a portfolio bank here in my town in Arkansas, that if they detect it, they will absolutely call it due on you. So you would want to be careful of that. And typically, if you're making the payments, the bank doesn't know or care.
Yeah, I would imagine that, especially if interest rates are this low, as long as it's performing, they wouldn't really care. But maybe 10 years down the road or 5 years, if interest rates are at 10%, they might want to call the small ones due just to make more profit. But
Yes. You
one
make a good point there, by the way. That's a very astute observation. Yep.
one question I did have in terms of the logistics. So let's just say, I buy one from you, Paul, subject to,
Mhm.
and it's $1,000 a month. So do I give you the $1,000? Like, how do I know that?
If I'm the seller, no. I sell it to you. I transfer title to you. The title's in your name or your LLC's name, and you start making payments directly to the bank. So you have an LLC checking account most likely, and
Yeah.
and the check is being written to the bank from you.
Okay. So there isn't that risk of the seller holding it and not dispersing it to the bank.
Right. Now, I mean, you can set it up that way. I just wouldn't recommend that you send it to a seller who probably was in some sort of financial or emotional or life distress. You don't want to you don't want their drama affecting your business. And so what I do is I take the drama out of their life, and I take it on me to make their payments, and whatever's going on in their life, whether it be drama or just life happens, they can move on. And I say it that way. I'll make your payments and you can move on with life.
Yep. That's awesome. So you have 20 deals in the first 18 months. What are kind of like your biggest lessons learned so far in investing?
Good question. Control the deal is the first thing that I learned, is that I want to have access to deals myself. And then 2, do not become technique minded or technique driven. What I mean by that is don't go around always trying to do a sub 2. Don't go around always trying to be a wholesaler. Learn the different tools of the trade and walk around within a complete tool belt and recognize the value of a given deal, and then you pull out the right instrument at the right time. You don't want to walk around with a hammer looking for a nail everywhere. There's not always a nail. Sometimes you need a different implement for a different problem. So I do teach to be focused on one type of real estate. If you're going to do single family, do single family. If you're going to do multifamily, do multifamily. If you're going to do mobile homes, do mobile homes. Those are all great. Pick your vertical and then own it, but then use the different tools of the trade in order to monetize the deal as it makes best sense for you, because then you can adapt to any given market, any market condition, and whether it's going up or down. You can learn how to be profitable very quickly and adapt to the market more quickly when you have these tools built into your repertoire.
I can already see that this episode is going to be very full of quotes. You're like a walking quote machine over here. It just reminds me, I put a deal under contract on Friday. My broker brought it to me,
Mhm.
and he bought it at an auction. And he's like, hey, I'll wholesale it to you for $47,000. And I'm going through this blanket loan refinance right now. So I got a lot of moving pieces,
Mhm.
and I didn't have 50K lying around. So I was like, okay, I need to either contact my previous private lenders, or I need to figure out something. And I was like, hey, I just asked them, would you mind carrying a note for 3-4 months while I reposition the home? So obviously needed some work. He bought it at an auction, but it was just some carpet painting and things like that. And you could put in a tenant in, I would say, about a month and a half.
Mhm.
And he's like, let me talk to my partner about it. And, we have a great relationship. I've done 3 deals with him before. I love working with him. And he came back to me 2 days later and he's like, sure, we can do it. So we just want X amount of interest and X amount of down payment, and let's do this deal. It makes much more sense than trying to get another third party private lender in there, or trying to figure out some sort of conventional financing or whatnot, and just working with him. And then once it's, fully occupied, getting a long-term loan on it. So the reason why I say this is, like you just mentioned, you want to have lots of tools in your tool belt, because if all you have is a hammer, then like you said, all you are able to hit are nails, right?
Right.
But what if you need a screwdriver or a wrench? Being able to do that was kind of very beneficial for me in this case, because that deal has about 20K of equity in it, estimation. And I was able to take that down because I asked that question and was familiar with seller carryback.
Exactly. If you know what's out there, you know what to ask for, right? And so I actually refer to this as, in my mind, it's what I call the martini method. So you picture a martini glass, and you have this wide kind of funnel of deals that are coming at you. And as you're going down the stem of the martini glass, that's my hierarchy of offers that I make. The first one I always make, in the situation where you did the right thing, you ask the seller for the loan effectively first, right? So you start off with owner financing, then you go sub 2, then you go lease option, then you go wholesaling, and you go kind of in that order. Or even before you go lease option or wholesaling, you go for private money, and then you think about maybe institutional money, and then you maybe do a lease, then you wholesale it. And wholesaling is like the last thing on the list, because when you're wholesaling your future. It is not a stream of income. It is a chunk of money, and you have to go find another deal. I'd much rather have one deal give me residual income for the next 20 years than cashing in now and getting access to capital that I don't know what to do with. I have to go find another way to deploy it. So you have this hierarchy of offers that you make, and they don't always work. And you start off with owner financing, then you go to sub 2. Oh, there's no mortgage on it. Okay, well, how about we do private money? How about we do commercial loans? How about we do this? And you just kind of go down this hierarchy, and you figure out where you can find access to the capital for the given deal.
So definitely there are many ways that an investor can find capital to fund their next deal. It's just that you have to figure out what strategy is right for that particular acquisition. We have much more to cover in next week's episode. It's going to be part 2 of our interview with Paul Thompson. So if you thought that was helpful, please do us a huge favor and leave us a review on iTunes. We'll see you right back here next week for another exciting episode of the Bigger Cash Flow Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Bigger Cash Flow Podcast. Please remember that opinions of the guests are their own, and nothing on this show should be considered personal or professional advice. Please consult your tax, legal, or financial advisor for personal advice that fit your unique situation. See you next time.